Yeah, so I've lived in DC for 2 years now, which I think is like not that uncommon for like somebody of my profile. But I got involved in organizing last summer during the uprisings after the killing of George Floyd. Sunrise was kind of a natural place for me to plug in there. And the first project that I got started working on at Sunrise was the Reclaim Rent Control campaign, which Jobs with Justice is spearheading. And that's something that, it was interesting, like getting immersed in organizing from the perspective of like both being able to learn from folks like Eliana, who is one of the staff at Jobs with Justice, and also learning, like the DC movement ecology at the same time. I have worked super cllosely with Ina and Eliana, who is no longer an organizer with Jobs with Justice, and in that process, kind of like built a relationship with folks like Elizabeth. Sunrise DC, in that time joined the steering committee of Jobs with Justice, and recently I was elected to the executive board. And I think a lot of that comes from being able to work really closely together, being able to plug our volunteer organizers in with the folks that are part of the coalitions that Jobs with Justice puts together, and being able to bring those things together and bring a lot of energy to it. I mean, in all candor, that's a little bit in flux right now, but I would say, we kind of span the length of between direct community engagement in terms of mutual aid, in terms of working with tenant organizers and stuff, and also working on advocacy. So my sphere is more of housing advocacy work. So working on the Reclaim Rent Control campaign and working on the various pieces that we included in Sunrise DC's like housing policy platform for this year. But it kind of, the idea is building power in the community and then being able to bring that to bear to get policies changed, and making sure that we're doing good in both spaces. Well, Sunrise, I think, from its inception is an environmental group. Sunrise DC is affiliated with the National Sunrise Movement, but we have, a broader mission of, achieving justice in a lot of spheres and bringing to bear a climate lens on that. Housing is a huge part of that for, a variety of reasons, and I kind of see them as dovetailing. The first is that, the largest source of pollution in the United States is the built environment in terms of housing and transportation and stuff. But that's also where people that work live, and that's how people that work get to their jobs. And so the labor component and the environmental component are really like, they're intermeshed really closely. Making sure that people have a place to live is also like a part not just of, stopping the emissions that cause climate change, but it's also like really important to keeping people safe through the things that climate change brings. When there's storms and summer heat waves and stuff, people having a place to go and people having a place to live is like critical to just surviving. Like in heat waves, people die outside. In the winter, people die outside, and we don't want to see that happen. And that's intrinsic to fighting climate change, is making sure that there are community solutions to it as well. The Reclaim Rent Control campaign is about improving the rent control system in DC, which places a cap on how much landlords can increase rent for their tenants. It only applies right now to very large buildings, and in particular very old buildings. Only anything, I think, built before 1970. I might need correction on that. Only anything built before 1970. And the goal of the Reclaim Rent Control campaign is to expand it to smaller buildings, because we know that if you're a tenant and whether there are 3 or 4 units in your building, like that doesn't make you different from somebody who lives in a 5-unit building. But that's where the law cuts off right now. And so the idea is to bring it down to smaller buildings to make sure that those tenants have the same protections. And then also making sure that there's a rolling deadline, so that, when we see new construction going up, that's important because, people need a place to live, but also the people that live in those buildings deserve the same tenant protections. And somebody that is living in a building that was built in 1971 is not different than somebody living in a building built in 1970. And so the idea is to bring those protections to many more tenants, and especially to reverse the decline in the number of rent-controlled units from something like, I want to say 120,000 to like 90,000 or so today, making sure that instead of that number decreasing every year, it's going up. Yeah, so it's taken a couple of forms. The first is, the very active legislative campaign. Sunrise DC has been a part of that in terms of turning people out for hearings, in terms of trying to speak directly to council members, which, goes into the next point of, using the protest tools that, we have brought to bear for like a lot of different causes into this housing sphere, working both with Reclaim Rent Control and with the Cancel Rent Coalition. And we have from time to time visited council members' houses to ask, hey, like, why are you not moving on this legislation that will help keep people in their homes? And then in addition to that, there's a pretty active public education campaign on this, working with like a lot of different community groups. This is something that Eliana Rondon has been absolutely fantastic on. The list of groups that she's held teach-ins with is like probably taller than me now. So I would say that it's kind of rests on those three prongs of, a legislative strategy, a community action strategy, and a public engagement strategy to make sure that, folks know what we are fighting for and know why it matters to them. Making sure people's voices are heard to legislators, and then making sure legislators are doing their jobs. DC Jobs with Justice has been integral to the Reclaim Rent Control project. I learned everything that I know from DC Jobs with Justice organizers and people convened by DC Jobs with Justice. And really the work that Sunrise DC does as a part of Reclaim Rent Control is like really directly tied into, stuff that comes from DC Jobs with Justice, comes from folks like Eliana, folks like Ina Padua, who recently left, really following their lead and learning from them. And, especially like the ability that DC Jobs with Justice has to convene all of those groups together is a really powerful tool for expanding the reach of any organization that's working with DC Jobs with Justice. As soon as you're in that coalition space, you have access to the whole movement in DC. I think that the biggest piece of joining the DC Jobs with Justice board is, having that level of engagement as a community group, which is the seat that I sit in, and being able to engage with folks in the labor community, like folks from, the Metro Washington Council of the AFL-CIO, folks from SEIU 1199, being able to interface with them and making sure that, the work that we're doing in the community is also directly tied to labor justice. Because, similar to, what I was mentioning with housing earlier, there's really two sides to things. There's fighting for workers in their workplace and fighting for workers everywhere else. And that's really like the strength that DC Jobs with Justice has, convening those things to bring to bear like both of those facets of worker justice. There's a couple of different pieces. I think the first is just the decision to actually get involved. I think, DC is the nation's capital. There's a lot of people that care a lot about politics, but, they care about politics. They read about it and they talk about it with their friends, but, and maybe their day job deals with some aspect of policy. But often those people are not really, those are not the people that you see out on the streets. Those are not the people that you necessarily see, working mutual aid or doing tenant organizing. And so I think that decision to get started is kind of one of the fundamental things, just joining a community group or getting involved with something like the Reclaim Rent Control campaign, which I think, is just as simple as like, I think putting your email address into the website. And there's definitely like a number of people that are not affiliated with any organization that play key roles in the Reclaim Rent Control campaign. I can think of somebody that, their day job was as a housing policy advocate, but they as an individual were involved because, their organization, for whatever reason, decided to sit it out. And that, is something that I think is like really powerful to make sure that people that have that expertise are still able to get involved. And also, being able to grow expertise. I think we were talking earlier about Kush and Auta, like neither of them were organizers before getting involved in Sunrise either. And I think they got involved around the same time I did, like roughly May, June of last summer. And now, they have name recognition all around DC. not that fame is the end all be all, but definitely getting involved in community organizations. And there's a number of community organizations that are affiliated with Jobs with Justice to get involved with. Not just Sunrise DC, but Democratic Socialists of America is involved. Working Families Party works very closely. And you can just go to the website and there's a whole list. And it's not just labor groups, but it's also community groups, it's faith groups. And so there's a lot of different ways that people can get involved through those. And I think that that's really the easiest way, as opposed to just approaching something, as just like a fresh baby-faced, 21-year-old or something. But coming into it in a place where you can learn and grow, and definitely the organizers at DC Jobs with Justice do a great job of that. I've mentioned several times now how much I learned from Eliana and Nina throughout this process, both about reclaim rent control and about organizing generally. Yeah, I think the unique role that DC Jobs with Justice has in DC organizing, both for the campaigns that are ongoing and campaigns going into the future is, in my view, there's really no better place for convening, a broad coalition of groups. Certainly in the housing work that I have worked on, being able to talk both with people that do strictly housing organizing, people that do union work and are advocating on behalf of their members, people that are in the legal field and are experts on, the policy issues. Being able to bring those things together is it's invaluable. It's expertise that, an all-volunteer group like Sunrise DC, can't always rely on internally. But in the, DC organizing space generally, all of those abilities are there. And so DC Jobs with Justice does a great job of bringing those, different components together and, coming up with a strategy that can integrate all of them so that everybody is able to, contribute to that in a meaningful way and, build on the gains that they're achieving together. Definitely in the fights going forward, I think we're looking at the end of the eviction moratorium is a big one. And definitely coming into the new year, there's going to be an additional, legislative and budget cycle in DC Council. And so those are all things that we're looking ahead to. Definitely, with the recovery happening after, the economic calamity that has come with the pandemic, we're looking forward to a lot of, labor fights through that to make sure that, as DC is recovering from the pandemic, that, that is not something that is just going to, build a city for folks that, are not really invested in the community. And not just doing that in the negative sense, but also building a recovery for folks that live here in DC, for folks that grew up in DC, folks that have family ties to DC that might want to move back someday. Making sure that those things are all, being considered, especially in the next year when, a lot of this stuff is going to come up. I think the thing that, draws me into DC Jobs with Justice and keeps me involved is definitely the community of people that it brings together that are, fighting for change in all of these different facets. The organizers at DC Jobs with Justice are experienced and tremendously helpful and just great people on top of that. And if you are trying to organize for change in your community, it is a fantastic place to get involved with campaigns that are already happening or just to learn from the organizers that are there. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there is anything that especially stands out. I think, in convening the spaces that DC Jobs with Justice does, it's not always about those big rallies. It's often about, the meetings and the emails that are, the often exhausting part of organizing. And that's something that DC Jobs with Justice, I think, by providing spaces, by convening people together, by, working together and having, dedicated strategy on these campaigns, that's what's really very useful. Reclaim Rent Control had a reconsideration of its strategy earlier this year. And those sessions were, very helpful, both for understanding how to move forward with this campaign, but also understanding, these groups that maybe I talk to somebody once or twice a month, but in this space, we can have a candid conversation about why something is, important to the values of this particular group as opposed to, something that Sunrise DC might be concerned with. And that's a really important part of just working together and organizing on a citywide level.